सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
For sure, as a cricket nut, I am heartbroken like a billion plus fellow Indians at India's defeat. So this episode of Cut the Clutter is not about that defeat. One, because there isn't that much clutter to cut about a game of cricket, that way T20 cricket. And second, what's been happening with Indian cricket for the past couple of years is more a matter of opinion for me. I'm much too biased in this area on this issue than to be decluttering it. Plus, I'm not an expert. I would only say one thing, that T20 is a game for very young people. We don't have a particularly young team. We did not field a particularly young team in this T20. It's been a decade since India has won an ICC trophy. That's the other issue. The third issue is the issue specific for the past 2 years, and it does look like that in his desperate hurry to dismantle the Kohli Shastri regime, Saurav Ganguly has put in place the Dravid Rohit regime. But the basic difference is they are all good people, great people, they have the best interest of India at heart, but the basic difference in their approach is that under Shastri and Kohli, India had built a new idea of cricket around pace and aggression. Right now, if you look at this team, it was mostly medium pace and reputation. And you know what? Reputation can be your enemy in a T20 game because you have no time to think, which means that if you take a couple of overs settling down as openers, some of the reputations to be guarded in this team are right at the very top. If one of your openers takes 27 balls to score 27 runs, that is more than 1/5 of your batting overs, batting delivery is gone, and you've nearly lost the match there itself. So maybe after this, India will have a younger team. But as I told you, that's more opinion than any decluttering, because every Indian must have opinion on cricket, because deep inside us, we are even more cricket pundits than political pundits. Now, that said, let's move on to another defeat today. Another defeat or victory, depending on which side of the battlefield you are on. And this is in the Ukraine war. And the reason we find it so significant is that this is something that shakes up geopolitics. One, this has weakened Putin dramatically, suddenly, and this will make the few friends or allies that Putin has. He doesn't have many allies. He has some reluctant friends, say China, India, who will now be also rethinking their positions, because if Russians are on the retreat like this consistently, unless he does something dramatic to recover lost ground, this would mean he's losing some of the bigger powers in the world who might have been more patient with him so far. Now to continue having Iran as your friend is not such a good use, because with Iran, in any case, everything will be purely transactional. Now, where has this defeat come? Look at the map. This defeat has come in the city of Kherson. Now, we've talked about this in the past. In fact, just about 2 months back in our episode 1073, we had seen a decisive battle building up at Kherson. Why is Kherson so important? It's a city of 250,000 people, which is a lot given how large cities are in those parts of Europe. In fact, in most of Europe, it's the only provincial capital that the Russians had captured. That is the capital from which they have now retreated. So as we speak, about a body of about 40,000, remember, 40,000 Russian troops of various kinds are making their way back across the Dnieper River to the safety of the eastern bank of the river, because eastern bank of the river, Russians are on their own side, so to say, because they control Crimea, which they had occupied in 2015. So they think that they have their backs to their own territory, although that's very tenuous, and we'll explain that. And look at this map. Kherson was the only territory that the Russians had occupied on the West Bank of Dnieper River. So they had crossed the river. So think of any city which is located on two sides of a river. Think of London, for example. There is like the main London and there is the London across the Thames River. So there is Delhi, which is seen like the main body, the main city of Delhi. And then there is a Jamna Par, right? The Trans-Jamna Delhi. In fact, there used to be an old joke, Sare Dukhiya Jamna Par. That said, today the situation is that the Russians, in the first flush of the invasion in February, their troops had come in from Crimea. Ukraine was taken by surprise, but not just surprise. Ukraine wasn't just ready, and Ukraine did not make the mistake that maybe defenders of medieval battles had sometimes made, which is fighting to the last man, which is stockading yourself, building fortresses, because you know what? Under siege, all fortresses ultimately fall. So Ukrainians, instead of fighting, quickly withdraw at that point. So Russians occupied this area quite comfortably and they occupied Kherson. Kherson became Russia's only foothold on the other side of the Dnieper River. And why we call Kherson a Russian foothold across the Dnieper River? It wasn't like a tiny foothold. It was a large area of 4,300 square kilometers. That is 1/5 more than our entire state of Goa. So Goa is 3,700 kilometers. The area that the Russians had occupied across the Dnieper River around Kherson city, which they have now retreated from, is 4,300 square kilometers. So it's a lot. You know, in warfare, rivers are very interesting and very important obstacles. Usually wars are fought across water obstacles. In the mountains, they are fought across mountain passes, but in the plains, river obstacles. And this is not a small river. This is a very wide perennial river with a lot of water into it. And in this particular region, this is on the extreme south of Ukraine. So the river is actually emptying out in the Black Sea, and the river breaks into many branches, and it's a very large delta. This is the access that the Ukrainians have through the river into Black Sea. So in fact, the shipping or large boats can come in right from up north and go into Black Sea and vice versa. It was in that region that the Russians crossed the river, went to the other side, captured the city of Kherson without much fighting. And since then, they've been consolidating there. And because they consolidated there, their ideas of sort of expanding their hold into Ukraine had come from their control of Kherson. Again, look at the map. Look at the map which we've taken from Worldometer. We've marked some areas so you know which are the areas of interest. This area is not far from some key points of strategic advantage. For example, Russians had the notion, which they had announced once, of actually controlling all of the Black Sea coast, all of Ukraine's Black Sea coast, which would also mean taking over the port of Odessa. On way to Odessa, taking over the city of Mykolaiv. Now, Mykolaiv, you see, is not far from Kherson. In fact, much of the offensive, which was a very carefully planned offensive, there was no frontal assault on Kherson, on Soviet troops who were dug out there. No, nothing of the sort. No kamikaze-style attacks. But the base from which the Ukrainians operated was Mykolaiv. And initially, it had looked like it's a matter of a week or two, if not days, before the Russians take over the city of Mykolaiv as well. And if they had done so, they would not have been far from Odessa anyway. Kherson to Odessa, which is the largest port in Ukraine, is only 91 kilometers. And if they had taken that, then they had the notion of expanding their hold along the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, going into Moldova, where, remember, there is the territory of Transnistria, where the Russians have influence and some troops and some loyal military units there. So the whole idea that they will then expand this into Moldova and then, from Putin's point of view, settle some injustices of the breakdown of the Soviet Union. That didn't happen. In fact, the opposite has happened. So the Russian troops, who in turn came under siege from Ukrainian troops. Why? Because they were dependent on a bunch of bridges, particularly a bridge called the Antonovsky Bridge on Dnieper River. I told you Dnieper River is not a tiny river. For their supplies, that bridge continued to be hit by the Ukrainians, and Ukrainians ran a very clever strategy. They fought not by way of assaulting, because when you assault, you expose yourselves, and Russians have good weapons, they know how to fight. They were very well dug in. They didn't do that. They, in fact, carried out a new kind of guerrilla warfare, which is guerrilla warfare with long-range artillery, rockets, and also probing missions to keep harassing the Russian units there. And then using the same long-range artillery to go over the Russian defenses and attack this bridge and other chota bridges there. And if the Russians put up any new bridges, particularly pontoon bridges, those were also taken down. So it does two things. One, it makes your resupplies very, very different. Second, it makes your troops who are the other side of the river very, very insecure. So instead of thinking now, for those troops thinking, look, I have now crossed the river, now I'm going, I'll take Odessa, and then I will go to Moldova, etc. Because they are stalled there, if they stir out just a little bit, they are taken down by Ukrainian artillery. So this was guerrilla warfare by artillery, by long-range artillery. So these troops, their morale kept on running low, and Russians increasingly found it difficult struggle to keep such a large body of troops supplied. So in fact, if you see the video of the conference of the Russian commanders which has come out, and at this conference, General Surovikin, I will just tell you the full name and how, General Surovikin stands up. He tells his defense minister, General Sergei Shoigu, that look, my troops are there, people are there, it's become very difficult to resupply them. It's difficult for us to defend this. I think we should withdraw these troops. And then General Shoigu, the defense minister, responds. This is all on camera. The Russians have released these videos. And significantly, Putin is not present there, because who wants to be sitting next to a defeat, that to a mega defeat like this? So General Surovikin said, we can't defend this place anymore. We need to withdraw our troops. And General Shoigu replies on camera, he says, Sergei Vladimirovich, which is the first name of General Surovikin, Sergei Vladimirovich, I agree with you. Take all measures to withdraw these troops and civilians who we need to protect in the nearest future. And that's how this retreat started. Now, Ukrainians, I will share some links from international press for you, also statements by Ukrainians. Ukrainians initially was very cagey. Ukrainians thought that this is too dramatic, much too dramatic, this might be a trap. So initially they said, even though the Russians removed their flag from the main administrative building in Kherson, Ukrainians said, we are not going in, it may be a trap, there may still be a lot of Russians there, the place may be booby-trapped, mined, who knows, and Russians know all the ranges and everything. Maybe once we get there, Russian long-range artillery will hit us. So they've taken their time going inside. But the fact is there is sufficient satellite and other information now available, evidence now available, that Russians have withdrawn, and Russian withdrawal and retreat is for real. And now how serious is it in battlefield sense? So Russia in fact, after the initial attack, when they made a lot of progress, they took a lot of territory, and a lot of Russian fans, even in India, said, where is the problem? They've taken 20% of the territory. Zelensky will soon sue for peace. Now this is completely reversed. This is about 260 days into the war. If you look at the situation, Kyiv, first of all, they came and laid siege to Kyiv, when even I made the mistake of starting my national interest for that week by saying that by the time you read this, Kyiv would most likely have fallen, right? It's been 260 days since then. Not only has Kyiv not fallen, but much else has happened. First of all, the Russians came and laid siege around Kyiv. They were on the outskirts of Kyiv, and then they were defeated, and they beat a very ignominious retreat out of Kyiv. Then similarly, they retreated from Kharkiv. Kharkiv is the second biggest town in Ukraine. They had not captured it, but they had laid siege to it. Looked like they were on the verge of capturing it. Kharkiv is also very close to Russia's border, Russian mainland's borders, and also to Belarus. As you can see, this is up north, but they were defeated there. They were defeated as new long-range artillery came into Ukraine. They were defeated and they withdrew from there. Third, now they've retreated similarly from Kherson, which is again a big prestigious holding that they had. So this is an endless series of case serials. Except that most of the case serials you were used to watching on TV, they usually had, if I remember correctly, I didn't see any of those, but I would presume generally had a happy ending. But each one of these is turning into a terrible military defeat for almighty Russia, because who had given the Ukrainians any chance? Now, what have the Ukrainians done? Let me first give you 1 minute of military explanation of what the Ukrainians have done. Read the words of Zelensky. So Zelensky made a statement to television channels, his official statement to his official channels, where he said, and that's a very important thing, he said, we move carefully, without emotion, without unnecessary risk. And that's precisely what Ukrainians have done. They've tried as far as possible to avoid physical contact with Russian troops or Russian defenses or even Russian tanks, armor, or even Russian aircraft. They've tried to deal with them on a beyond visual range and also keep themselves as safe as possible. And that's how, in fact, they've bogged the Russians down. Russians have stretched their supply lines. Then they've used their long-range artillery to hit the supply lines, hit the ammunition dumps. So what they have carried out is the modern equivalent, 21st century equivalent of guerrilla warfare with long-range artillery, long-range rockets and anti-missile systems. So as the Russians have continued to fire missiles at them, now Ukrainians are able to block or intercept more than 80% of those missiles. So once again, a great defensive battle militarily, which can be turned into defensive offense. Usually people say, offensive defense. In this case, this is defensive offense. So initially, as the Russians came in, they had parties to delay the Russians, so they traded space with time, which means, okay, give me a couple of days to get my people out, right? Until then I will fight, then I will get out. You will get this space then. So traded space with time. Once the Russians had come in deep enough, then by that time, the Ukrainians were supplied by these long-range weapons, and they've been using these and completely outclassing the Russians. So that is the reason the picture on the battlefield has shifted so dramatically. Now, I told you early on, I said that this has geopolitical implications. So what happens now? So Joe Biden, when he came out to speak to the media after his midterm election results, which actually did not go at all as badly for him as was widely anticipated, did not go as well for the Republicans as was widely anticipated. In fact, Republicans who thought that they will be celebrating, particularly the Trumpians who thought they'll be celebrating, now an infighting is broken out between them. So Biden said in his statement, I found it interesting that the Russians waited till after election. Now, the implication is that if they had announced the retreat before the voting, that would have been a shot in the arm for Biden, that his strategy has made Putin suffer these massive reverses. So he's actually saying it half seriously. He's not joking. He might be making fun of Putin or he might be taunting him, but he's basically saying that you guys waited for a day because you thought that if you had withdrawn before the voting, it might harm Trump's interests. So Biden is setting it up in the context of polarized American domestic politics as well. Then, geopolitically, Biden said one more thing, talking about the Russia-China link. Again, it's a direct quote from him. He says, and I quote, I don't think there is a lot of respect that China has for Russia or for Putin. I don't think they look at that as a particular alliance. Matter of fact, they've been sort of keeping distance a bit. So once again, he's giving the Chinese a little space for maneuver. Now, militarily and on the ground. So what are the implications of the fall of the Kherson for Russians and its return to the Ukrainians? Number one, this controls the only land route from mainland Ukraine into the Crimean Peninsula. Now, Crimean Peninsula is what the Russians had captured in 2014, and nobody gave, even now, most analysts don't give Ukraine any hope of getting it back. The fact is, it's the only land route coming in from the Ukrainian mainland into Crimean Peninsula that the Russians control. That has now gone. Number two, Ukrainians have got one more point of access, and a large point of access with a port with a port into the Black Sea, and the Russians have been denied it by implication. Number 3, if you look further up the Dnieper River, there is a place called Kakhovka and Nova Kakhovka. That is where a big dam is located. And that dam supplies fresh water to Crimean Peninsula. Now, will the Ukrainians stop it? The fact is that in 2014, when the Russians had occupied Crimea, Ukrainians had shut down a Soviet-era canal in Kherson, which took fresh water from Nova Kakhovka, etc., to Crimea. They had shut that canal down. They had stopped it. Russians, once they took over Kherson, had reopened that canal. Now that source of water, the control over that source of water will also return to the Ukrainians. Third, once the Ukrainians come this far now, even on the West Bank, they may not come on the East Bank. Russians may still be able to defend it for some time. From there, they get much closer to other closely held areas of the Russians, particularly in the general southern region, not far from Crimea. So a lot of that will come in their HIMAR long-range artillery range. So they can now hit a lot of the Russian big logistics bases behind them. And you know what? There's also the city of Mariupol that we had spoken about earlier. In fact, we had more than one episode of Cut the Clutter on that. I'll see if you can find one and share it with you. It was a bit noisy. You might remember I had done it outdoors in Mumbai. Now, if you look at Mariupol is a crucial, it's also a port city. It's also crucial for Russia. It's also a prestige target because it took them a long time fighting and taking it. That's where Ukrainians fought sort of to defend a citadel, and that's where the Azov battalion was. Most of it died or got injured. Some were taken prisoner, and those exchanges still keep taking place. And those are the soldiers, that was the regiment that Putin called Nazis or neo-Nazis. Now Mariupol will come under threat, not because the Ukrainians will cross the river at Kherson and drive to Mariupol. It isn't that close from Kherson to Mariupol. Even if they cross the river, it's almost 378 kilometers. So that will not work. But the fact is that north of Mariupol, a lot of the territory is still with Ukrainians. So they could then build assaults from there, again on the same pattern that they've done so far, without exposing any large bodies of their troops, of their tanks, or their assault mobile units, etc. Similarly, harassing the Russians until their will breaks. Because you know what? Everybody is suffering in this war. The Russians have suffered gravely. As we speak, there is photo or video evidence of nearly 1,500 Russian tanks being destroyed. And you can imagine how many people would have got killed. Almost 1,500. More than that are other armored vehicles and much more. So Reuters gives us a statement from American Army General Mark Milley, who was speaking at the Economic Club of New York, where he said that the Russians have had casualties of about 100,000 plus, 1 lakh plus. Not all killed. So if you apply the conventional logic of 1 fatality for any 3 battle wounded, that would mean 33,000 Russians have been killed. Now there are other estimates. Of course, Ukrainian claims are many more. Russians haven't given us their estimates for a long time now. Generally, it's widely accepted that the Russians have lost more than 30,000 lives already. That's more than all the lives lost by, unfortunately, all of our Indian armed forces in all our battles, insurgencies, etc., etc., etc. In fact, you can go and count the numbers at the National War Memorial, which is not far from where I sit and record this in New Delhi. In fact, it's next to India Gate. Do check it out. So it's a lot of damage for a population of just about 14 crores. Now, it's not as if the Ukrainians haven't suffered. They might have suffered similar kind of casualties also, but they are fighting to defend their own land, their own nation. So the motivation levels are a bit different from going to a distant land and trying to occupy that country and then getting stuck and then being forced on repeated retreats. That is the difference. But the other important things that General Milley says, that his estimate is that among those dead on the Ukrainian sides, there are about 40,000 civilians. So this is a terrible war. It's not good for everybody. How can it stop? We don't know. But as we speak now, barring the first 3 weeks of the war, the Russians have been facing reverses, and they've now been slowly but inexorably, they've been traversing their way back now.